Ever feel like medical breakthroughs are straight out of science fiction these days? We're going deep on one of those today.
Like what? What have you got?
Gene editing, the kind of thing that could maybe erase inherited diseases altogether.
Whoa, really, like completely gone.
Yeah, potentially. Think like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's. What if those couldn't be passed down anymore? That's the kind of power we're talking about with tools like CRISPR.
I see what you mean about science fiction, but that's got to come with some serious ethical questions, right? Especially for like different religions and stuff.
Exactly. Huge ethical questions.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to dig into specifically from an Islamic perspective this time. We've got an expert with us. They're going to break down this research paper by Dr. Sayyid Mohammed Muhsin and Dr. Alexis Heng Boon Chen.
Okay, so they're looking at this from within Islamic thought then.
Yeah, they get into the Islamic legal principles around all this gene editing stuff. And honestly, it's fascinating.
All right, I'm intrigued. But before we get too far, didn't we have that whole thing a few years back? The gene-edited babies?
Oh, yeah. Back in 2018, that caused a huge uproar, understandably. It even led to a call for a moratorium on germline editing.
Germline editing, meaning?
A good point. It's editing the genes that get passed down to future generations, not just changing them in, like, one person.
Got it. That makes more sense why it was such a big deal.
Exactly. And that moratorium, it's actually about to end soon, which is why these conversations are more important now than ever. So we've got over 1 billion people following Islam. How do their beliefs play into all this? How do we balance this tech with that?
$1 million question, right? It's messy, but first, maybe we should talk about the elephant in the room using gene editing for enhancements. Yeah.
Enhancements as in?
Like, instead of fixing a disease, you're trying to make your kid super athletic or something, boosting their intelligence, stuff like that.
I see. So basically designer babies, but not even for health reasons, just extra stuff.
Right. And in Islam, that's widely considered haram, forbidden. It's seen as trying to play God, basically overstepping some major boundaries.
Yeah, when you put it like that, even I can feel intuitively there's a difference between fixing a disease and saying, I want my kid to be the next Mozart.
You get it. There's a definite ethical line there. But even when we're talking about preventing suffering, germline editing for Muslims isn't simple.
Oh, how so? You'd think preventing a disease would be pretty straightforwardly good.
You'd think so, but... Well, this paper we're looking at uses 5 key Islamic legal principles to analyze all this. It's like their framework for figuring this stuff out.
A moral compass, then, to navigate these uncharted waters. So what's the first principle we should keep in mind?
First one's Qawaid, which basically means intention. It's about the core purpose behind using this tech. Here, we're talking about helping Muslim couples who carry these diseases so they can have healthy kids, biologically.
And that makes me think of Islamic views on family and lineage and all that, especially with how adoption is viewed, which is different from some other cultures.
Super important point. Lineage is huge EE in Islam. Adoption, like many people think of it, it's not quite the same. There's kafala, which is more like guardianship. The child's lineage is still tied to their biological family. It's nuanced but important.
So with that focus on biological connection, where do things like sperm donation or egg donation fit in?
Yeah, those get even trickier. In Sunni Islam, they're mostly considered prohibited. Bringing in a third party into the lineage like that, it's seen as conflicting with how sacred family is, keeping those biological lines clear. It's a core part of Islamic law.
So this desire for kids who are biologically related and healthy, that's really central to how Qawaid plays into all this.
100%. It ties into a bigger Islamic law concept, hifz al-nasl, that's all about protecting lineage. So even with something as modern as gene editing, these ancient principles are what's used to understand it.
It's amazing how much depth there is to this. Okay, so we've got Qawaid, our intention.
Yep.
What's next on this ethical compass?
Next up is Yaqin. This one's all about certainty.
Certainty of
Of the technology itself. How effective is it? Are there other options that might be safer or fit better with Islamic values? We can't just look at what we want to happen. We've got to look at the risks too. Clear-eyed, you know.
So with these genetic diseases, is gene editing the only way to prevent them? Or are there other things to consider?
Right, and that brings us to something called pre-implantation genetic testing, PGT. Might have heard of it with IVF.
PGT, yeah, that's where they screen embryos for problems before implanting them during IVF, right?
Exactly. It's actually pretty common. It can be used for a lot of different genetic disorders. By choosing embryos that don't have the bad gene, couples can seriously reduce the risk of passing those diseases on.
So if you can do PGT, does that make gene editing pointless? Or at least less necessary?
Sometimes, yeah, PGT is a good alternative. less ethically tricky. But there are cases where gene editing might be the better option.
Like what?
Like if both parents have the same dominant genetic disorder. So even getting one copy of that gene means their child will get the disease. Gene editing might be the only way to have a biological kid who's healthy in those cases.
Ah, so something like cystic fibrosis, which is recessive, PGT could work.
Yeah.
But for a dominant one like Huntington's, it's way harder.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, there's another option. Kind of falls between PGT and germline editing. In utero gene therapy.
Okay, now that one sounds intense. What is that?
So they take cells from the fetus after they diagnose a disease in the womb, edit those cells in a lab, then put the corrected ones back into the fetus.
Whoa, that's some next level stuff. What's the advantage there?
For one, you're working with way more cells in a fetus than a tiny embryo. So the actual gene editing part and then making sure there aren't mistakes, it's not as hard. Plus, in utero therapy avoids some of the ethical stuff around germline editing.
How so?
Because the changes aren't passed down to future generations. You're just targeting specific cells in that fetus, not messing with the reproductive cells themselves.
So it's like you're drawing a line.
Yeah.
Fixing a problem that one individual versus potentially changing their grandkids and so on. That's where Yaqin comes in, right? Weighing all these options, how well they work, how they fit with Islamic principles.
You've got it. But here's the thing. Even if these other options seem simpler, gene editing for this purpose, the ethical stuff runs deep. It's not risk-free, this tech.
And that brings us to the next principle, doesn't it? The potential downsides, the harm these edits could cause. We can't just ignore that.
Absolutely. And that's where comes in.
Okay, let's get into it. What kind of risks are we talking about here? What could go wrong?
So CRISPR, it's amazing, don't get me wrong, revolutionized this whole field, but it's not perfect. There's always the risk of what we call off-target edits.
Meaning?
The CRISPR, it's like molecular scissors, right? Sometimes those scissors, they cut in the wrong spot, they make changes to the wrong part of the DNA.
And with something this important, even a tiny mistake could be bad news.
Yeah.
Especially if it's germline editing, those mistakes get passed down, like you said.
Exactly. Huge concern. And then there's another thing too, mosaicism.
Mosaicism. That sounds not great. What is that?
It's when the cells in the embryo, they don't all get edited the same way. Some might have the change you wanted, others don't.
So even if you did the edit right in some cells, the mosaicism messes things up. Can't you just check for those errors, though?
That's the problem with working on embryos from IVF. You've only got a few to work with. It's really hard to be sure you caught every problem.
Like trying to do surgery in the dark with the tiniest tools imaginable. No room for error?
Pretty much. And when it's germline, affecting future generations, that's a heavy weight.
Makes you realize just how big this all is. We're not talking about one person, but their kids, their grandkids.
Wow. It gets bigger, too. Recent research found that early human embryos, they're not great at repairing the DNA breaks that CRISPR causes.
Wait, so not only could the edits be wrong, but the embryo might not even be able to fix itself properly afterwards.
Exactly. It's a lot. And all this ties into that harm principle.
So much to think about there. Okay, on to the fourth principle then, Ḍarurah. This one sounds even more serious. What does it mean?
Ḍarurah is about necessity. Is it urgent that we use this technology? See, we're not saving someone's life who's already here. We're trying to prevent suffering that might happen in the future. Big difference, ethically speaking.
So even if wanting to stop suffering is good, this principle asks if it's necessary to use something so powerful, so risky, when there might be other ways.
Right. And it also makes you think about where else those resources could go. It's about priorities within the Muslim community, like the idea of fiqh al-awlawiyat, how you prioritize limited resources.
So we're going beyond just one family's choice. We're thinking about the whole community.
That's a big part of Islamic bioethics, that wider view. Ḍarurah forces you to ask, are we using our resources for the most pressing needs?
It's a good reminder that these choices, they have ripple effects. We can't just focus on the individual. We've got to think about everyone.
And that takes us to our last principle for today, IRF.
IRF. That one's new. What's that about?
It's about the big picture again, but this time culturally. We have to consider what's considered acceptable and beneficial in society, too, not just religious law on its own.
So bridging the gap between these ancient principles and, like, modern-day life, how do those two work together? That's a lot to unpack, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And we're just getting started.
So IRF, it sounds kind of like, is it like the Arabic word for custom or something?
You got it. It's about customs, traditions. Recognizing that these ethical questions, they don't exist in a bubble. Yeah, Islamic law is based on scripture, tradition, all that. But it also looks at what's considered okay within a specific society, as long as it doesn't go against Islamic teachings, of course.
Makes sense. Balancing those core principles with, like, actually living in the modern world. So with gene editing, what's Earth telling us?
It's saying, look around. Globally, people want to prevent these awful genetic diseases. That makes sense, right? Nobody wants to see a kid suffer if it can be stopped.
Yeah, most people would agree. If we can prevent suffering, shouldn't we? At least that's the first thought.
Exactly. But Earth makes us think harder. It's not just, is preventing suffering good? It's also, is this how we do it? Is germline editing, with everything we've talked about, is it really the right way to go? Especially when there are those other options, like with Yaqin.
So taking a step back, not just the goal, but the method.
Exactly. Earth is about the societal stuff, what happens long term, respecting cultural sensitivities around all this. It's a lot.
You know, it's interesting. Each of these principles, they all connect back to the others, don't they? It's not like they're totally separate ideas.
Oh, totally. They work together, you know?
Right.
It's how you get a complete picture of a complex thing like gene editing through that Islamic lens.
Each one adds another layer. It's not a yes or no answer. It's about thinking it through.
And that's what's cool about this paper. It's not trying to say, gene editing IS this or it IS that, halal or haram, end of story. It's giving you the tools, these 5 principles. Muslims can use those to figure it out for themselves, make their own informed choices.
I like that. It's empowering. You can use your faith, your values, to decide what's right for you. No one's forcing a one-size-fits-all answer.
And that personal reflection is huge, especially with gene editing, right? Because this isn't just some theoretical idea.
Yes, real lives we're talking about. It could really change how people live, if they even get to live.
And that takes us back to something we kind of touched on earlier, that Islamic emphasis on community, taking care of each other.
Right. We've been focusing on individuals a lot, like
Right.
that couple deciding if they'll use this tech for their kid. But Islam, it's big on the whole group, right? The common good.
Yeah.
So how does that play into gene editing?
That's the question, isn't it? It gets bigger than just one family, one choice. This tech, changing someone's genes, that has consequences for everybody down the line. Future generations, too. It's not just up to us.
Like ripples in a pond. One decision spreading out, families, communities, heck, all of humanity eventually. I mean, you got the big picture stuff.
100%. And that's where those Islamic principles, they come in again.
So it's not just, is it allowed? It's, is it good? And who's it good for? We got to talk about fairness, too. Will all Muslims have access to this tech, rich or poor? Or is it just going to make things more unequal?
Huge, huge questions. And even if they can access it, are they getting enough information? Can they make a truly informed choice? Islam's all about knowledge, critical thinking.
Yeah.
We need to talk about this openly, honestly. All voices need to be part of it.
Giving everyone in the Muslim community the tools to decide what fits their beliefs.
Right.
Yeah.
And this goes beyond just Muslims, too. This gene editing thing, it's new for all of us. We need to talk to each other, different cultures, religions, everyone. It's about our shared future.
We're all figuring this out together. But like we've seen, Islamic thought, it's got a lot to say. It can help us be wise about this stuff. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, how these principles push us beyond just like a yay or nay kind of thing, you know? It's about how these choices could change society, not just one person's life.
It's really profound, isn't it? For instance, think about genetic diversity. That's something Islam places immense value on, diversity, as a reflection of God's creation.
Yeah, makes sense.
So if we start using gene editing to eliminate certain traits, what happens to that diversity long term? Could trying to get rid of suffering actually make us like less diverse as humans?
Ooh, I hadn't thought of that. It's easy to focus on, let's fix this one problem, but you're right, the big picture matters too.
Exactly. And that's where education comes in, talking about this stuff openly. Islam's all about knowledge, thinking critically. We need to have these conversations. Muslims, non-Muslims, everybody. What are the benefits, the risks, all of it.
So people can make their own choices, but informed ones.
Right. And this isn't just for scientists or religious scholars. This is for regular people too. We're all going to be impacted by this tech.
It really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? These Islamic principles, they give us a roadmap, but the journey's just beginning.
Well said. It's like we've got this amazing tool, gene editing, but tools can be used for good or bad. Yeah.
Exactly. It all comes down to, like you said, those values. Not just can we do this, but should we?
And are we prepared for what comes next? Because this technology isn't going away. If anything, it's going to get even more complex.
That's both exciting and a little scary, honestly. So much to think about.
No doubt. But that's how it should be, right? We've got
Yeah.
to be cautious, but also open to the possibilities.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thanks for taking the time to break all this down.
My pleasure. Hopefully this gets people talking, asking their own questions. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely. To everyone listening, keep diving deep. Talk to your friends, family, your religious leaders. Everyone's got a perspective on this. Read up on it. Figure out where you stand. Because at the end of the day, how we use this tech, it's up to all of us.